In 1945, Hans Kammler, one of the most influential and feared high-ranking officers of the SS, found himself trapped in an increasingly desperate situation as the Third Reich, which he had served with brutal efficiency, was irreversibly collapsing around him. As an SS-Obergruppenführer, Kammler wielded immense power, overseeing the construction of concentration camps and leading the development of advanced weapons systems. In 1944, Heinrich Himmler, convinced of the strategic importance of the V2 project, persuaded Adolf Hitler to place the project under the direct control of the SS. On August 8th, Hans Kammler replaced Walter Dornberger as the project director. From January 31st, 1945, Kammler became the head of all missile projects. During his tenure, Kammler also took partial responsibility for the operational use of V2 missiles against the Allies until the front lines reached Germany's borders. In March 1945, following advice from Joseph Goebbels, Hitler began gradually stripping Hermann Göring of various powers related to air support, maintenance and supply, transferring them to Kammler. This culminated in early April, with Kammler being elevated to the position of General Plenipotentiary of the Führer for jet aircraft. At that time, Goebbels proclaimed, "Faith in the final victory is unshakable, and we must ensure that our most advanced resources are in the right hands." On April 1st, 1945, Kammler ordered the evacuation of 500 missile technicians to the Alps. With the last launch of a V2 on the Western Front in late March on April 5th, Kammler was assigned by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht to command the defense of the Nordhausen area. However, instead of defending the missile facilities, he immediately ordered the destruction of all special V1 equipment at the Syke storage site. Kammler was the last SS officer to receive a promotion to the rank of SS-Obergruppenführer, effective March 1st, 1945. In his own words, "In times of desperation, loyalty and efficiency are our most valuable weapons." In the final days of the war, as Allied forces closed in on Germany, Kammler's trail suddenly went cold. The last confirmed sighting of the SS general was on April 17, 1945, less than 3 weeks before Germany's unconditional surrender. From that moment, Kammler's fate became shrouded in mystery, generating a multitude of theories and speculations that persist to this day. A prevalent theory suggests that Kammler, facing imminent capture and the prospect of being tried for his crimes, chose to take his own life. This scenario aligns with the actions of many high-ranking Nazi officials who, unwilling to face justice, opted for suicide in the final days of the Reich. However, the absence of a body or any concrete evidence of suicide has led some historians and researchers to propose more intriguing possibilities. Among them is the theory that Kammler, leveraging his knowledge of advanced Nazi technology, struck a deal with the American forces. Could Kammler, with his intimate knowledge of Nazi weapons programs, have been one of those granted a new life in America? On July 9, 1945, Hans Kammler's widow requested that he be declared dead as of May 9, 1945. To support her request, Kammler's driver, Kurt Preuck, declared that he had seen Kammler's corpse and was present at his burial on May 9, 1945. The Berlin-Charlottenburg District Court ruled on September 7, 1948, that Kammler's death was officially established as May 9, 1945. In a subsequent affidavit on October 16, 1959, it was stated that Kammler died approximately on May 10, 1945, although the exact cause of death was unknown. On September 7, 1965, another witness claimed that Kammler had died on May 7, 1945, and that his corpse had been seen by several people, who agreed that the cause of death was cyanide poisoning. The surrender of the great Obergruppenführer, the fall of Karl Wolff. With the outbreak of war, Wolff was assigned to the Führer's headquarters as Verbindungsoffizier der Waffen-SS. Today, there has been much debate about Wolff's actual roles at the headquarters. His closeness to Hitler not only allowed him to gain the Führer's trust, but also to assume the influential role of SS representative within Hitler's inner circle. At one point, Wolff, along with Heydrich, was considered one of the most likely candidates to succeed Himmler. Himmler, in a familiar tone, used to refer to him as Wolfchen, a play on his surname, and the term Wolfchen, meaning little wolf. his duties at the headquarters did not prevent him from continuing daily correspondence with the SS High Command in Berlin, so his post-war claims that he only learned of the Jewish massacres from 1945 onwards should be seen as a mere defensive argument to try to escape the prosecutor's charges. In fact, his prominent position in Hitler's circle led the Munich Public Prosecutor's Office in 1964 to define Wolff as Himmler's eyes and ears at the headquarters. If Wolff, in addition to being Himmler's right-hand man, was one of the close friends of Odilo Globocnik, the organizer of the Action Reinhard extermination program, it is evident that he could not have had less information than those SS members who, occupying a much lower place in the Nazi hierarchy, were fully aware of the crimes being committed. Here, at the epicenter of power, he could witness all the relevant events and obtain first-hand information on all matters affecting the government, the party, the SS, and the course of the war. Additionally, he was a frequent visitor to the Berghof whenever Hitler used it as a temporary residence. On May 13, 1945, the US Army captured Wolff under the false promise that they would allow him to reunite with his family and confined him in a prison near Bolzano. Unable to contact his family, on August 21, 1945, Wolff was transferred to the Nuremberg War Criminals Prison, initially as a defendant. However, none of the international tribunal prosecutors charged him, so Wolff appeared in numerous trials only as a witness. In January 1948, the American occupation authorities handed him over to the British, who imprisoned him in Minden, Rhineland. Subjected to a denazification process in November 1948, a Hamburg-Bergedorf court sentenced him to 5 years in prison for belonging to a criminal organization and for having knowledge of its criminal objectives. Of the 5-year sentence, 2 were deducted for his detention since May 1945. Wolff appealed the sentence, and in March 1949 the review court reduced the initial sentence to 4 years, which were considered fully served. After regaining his freedom, he worked in the advertising department of a magazine and moved to live with his family in Starnberg, Bavaria. Following the excitement created by the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, Wolff made the mistake of publishing several articles about Heinrich Himmler in the press, in which he claimed that he only learned of the Jewish massacres from March 1945 onwards and from third-party references. As a result of Wolff's statements and the letters of response that his articles generated, the German justice system began to investigate his participation in Nazi crimes. On January 18, 1962, a Weilheim court issued a warrant for his arrest for his involvement in the murder of hundreds of thousands of Jews, derived from his conversations with representatives of the Reich Ministry of Transport to solve the shortage of wagons needed for the rail transport of Jews to the extermination camps. The Weilheim court referred the case to a Munich court, where Wolff was imprisoned in Munich Stadelheim prison. His defender was Rudolf Aschenauer, a lawyer with extensive experience in defending Nazis accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. On September 30, 1964, Wolff was sentenced to 15 years in prison for his cooperation in the massacre of 300,000 Jews. In October 1965, the Federal Supreme Court dismissed his appeal, confirming the sentence. As a result, Wolff was transferred to Straubing Penitentiary, from which he was released in late August 1969 for medical reasons. His leading role in the SS and his contribution to preventing the kidnapping of Pope Pius XI attracted the attention of journalist Gerd Heidemann, a former editor of the magazine Stern. Wolff became Heidemann's advisor, and together they established contact with Stuttgart Militaria collector Konrad Kujau. This culminated in the episode of the forged Adolf Hitler diaries, which Stern published on March 25, 1983. In late August 1984, the trial against Kujau and Heidemann for forgery began. However, Wolff, summoned as a witness, could not appear as he had died on July 15th of that year in a hospital in Rosenheim and was buried 6 days later in the Prien am Chiemsee Cemetery, Bavaria. Karl Wolff was known in his family circle by the affectionate nickname Karele, which he retained until his death. Wolff's death attracted the attention of several major German newspapers, which described him as one of the most brilliant figures of the National Socialist regime. Klaus Sibyl wrote a biography about him, in whose preface he noted that Wolff represented the classic archetype of the German upper bourgeoisie, many of whose members, despite their higher education, were swept up by Nazism. The fate of the SS officers, the fall of the Black Order. While the fate of Hans Kammler remains shrouded in mystery, the final moments of SS-Obergruppenführer Walter Krüger paint a clear picture of desperation and defeat. Born in 1890 in Strasbourg, then part of the German Empire, Krüger's military career spanned both world wars, a testament to his unwavering commitment to German expansionism and, later, the ideologies of the Third Reich. Krüger's command of the 2nd SS Division, Das Reich, in March 1943, saw him lead troops in the Battle of Kursk, one of the largest and bloodiest engagements on the Eastern Front. His performance in this failed offensive paradoxically resulted in greater recognition, with the awarding of oak leaves to his Knight's Cross on August 31, 1943. As the tide of war turned against Germany, Krüger found himself in increasingly desperate situations. In July 1944, he was appointed General Commander of the 6th SS Army Corps, tasked with defending against the relentless Soviet advance. His efforts in the battles of the Courland Pocket, a series of engagements that saw German forces repeatedly repel Soviet attacks, earned him the swords to his Knight's Cross on January 11, 1945. The psychological impact of imminent defeat weighed heavily on Krüger and his fellow SS leaders. For Walter Krüger, the end came on May 22, 1945, in the Courland Pocket. Facing the imminent arrival of Soviet troops and the collapse of organized resistance, Krüger decided to take his own life rather than face capture and its consequences. While some SS generals disappeared into the post-war chaos, others faced a reckoning for their crimes. Among them was Friedrich Jeckeln, a man whose name became synonymous with some of the most horrific mass executions of the Holocaust. Born in 1895 in the German Empire, Jeckeln's path to infamy began with his joining the Nazi Party in 1929. His rise through the SS ranks was swift, driven by ruthless efficiency in persecuting the regime's enemies. In the blood-soaked annals of the Holocaust, few names evoke as much horror as Babi Yar. On September 29 and 30, 1941, under Jeckeln's meticulous direction, over 33,000 Jews were systematically murdered in a ravine outside Kiev. On January 27, 1942, Jeckeln received the War Merit Cross with swords for killing 25,000 Jews in Rumbula by orders from the highest level. In February 1945, now as General der Waffen-SS und Polizei, he was appointed to command the SS Freiwilligen Gebirgskorps and also served as commander of replacement troops and SS and police commander in southwestern Germany. Jeckeln's innovation in mass murder, the chilling Jeckeln system or sardine packing, spoke to the cold, calculating nature of his crimes. This method, first employed during the Rumbula massacre in November 1941, involved forcing victims to lie face down in mass graves, forming a grotesque human carpet to be executed with mechanical precision. His capture by Soviet forces near Halba in May 1945 marked the beginning of the end for this architect of genocide. Tried in Riga, Latvia in January 1946, Jeckeln faced a reckoning for his crimes against humanity. The Soviet military tribunal convened to try Jeckeln was a solemn affair, far from the pomp and circumstance of the Nuremberg trials. However, it was there that the full weight of Jeckeln's atrocities came to light. Confronted with the mountain of evidence against him, Jeckeln made a startling admission. "I must assume full responsibility for what happened within the borders of Ostland, within the SS, South Dakota, and Gestapo. This greatly increases my guilt. My fate is in the hands of the High Tribunal, so I only ask that it consider the mitigating circumstances. I will accept a sentence in full repentance, which I will consider a worthy punishment." The tribunal, having heard testimonies detailing the horrific scale of Jeckeln's actions, reached its verdict swiftly. Friedrich Jeckeln, once a feared SS general with the power of life and death over millions, was sentenced to face the hangman's noose. On February 3, 1946, in Riga's Victory Square, justice was served in full view of the public. Before a crowd of 4,000 spectators, Friedrich Jeckeln met his end at the gallows. The man who had overseen the deaths of countless innocents now hung lifeless, a grim symbol of the retribution awaiting those responsible for the horrors of the Holocaust. As the dust settled on the ruins of the Third Reich, Allied investigators began the monumental task of bringing Nazi war criminals to justice. The name Otto Rasch quickly rose to the top of their list. His role as commander of Einsatzgruppe C had placed him at the epicenter of some of the most horrific atrocities committed on the Eastern Front. The scale of the crimes committed by Einsatzgruppe C under Rasch's command was overwhelming. In Ukraine alone, the unit was responsible for some of the Holocaust's most infamous massacres. The death fields of Babi Yar stood as a grim testament to the efficiency of Rasch's killing machine. Over 33,000 Jews were systematically murdered there in September 1941, their bodies falling into the ravine that would become their unmarked grave. The methods employed by Rasch were as brutal as they were methodical. He personally supervised operations to ensure maximum efficiency in the grim task of mass murder. His unit used a variety of killing techniques, from public shootings that terrorized local populations to the use of gas vans that turned the simple act of breathing into a death sentence. As the Allies prepared to bring the architects of the Holocaust to justice, Rasch seemed destined to face the full weight of international justice. The evidence against him was overwhelming, his guilt seemingly indisputable. However, as his day of reckoning approached, Rasch's story took an unexpected turn. In the lead-up to what promised to be one of the most significant trials of Nazi war criminals, Otto Rasch's health began to deteriorate rapidly. As the judicial drama unfolded in Nuremberg, Rasch was conspicuously absent from the dock. His lawyers presented evidence of a severe illness that they claimed rendered him unfit to stand trial. The court, faced with medical testimony attesting to Rasch's grave condition, made a decision that would remain controversial for years. In February 1948, he was declared unfit to stand trial due to Parkinson's disease, from which he died on November 1st of that same year. Rasch spoke fluent English, French and Italian in addition to his native German. Odilo Globocnik, A Fate of Cyanide and Secrets. The scale of Globocnik's crimes was overwhelming. Operation Reinhard, which he oversaw with ruthless efficiency, resulted in the murder of approximately 1.5 to 2 million Jews. The methods employed in these camps were designed for maximum efficiency in killing, with victims often sent to the gas chambers within a few hours of their arrival. Globocnik's dedication to this grim task earned him the favor of Heinrich Himmler, who saw him as a loyal and effective executor of the final solution. The German surrender had occurred almost a month earlier. Nazi soldiers and officers were fleeing like rats across Europe, but despite the vastness of the continent, there were not many places to go. It was all hunger and destruction. A British patrol discovered some Nazi soldiers at the foot of the Alps. They tried to pass themselves off as peasants, but fooled no one. Once at the headquarters, under interrogation, they confessed to being part of the defeated army but denied having held any significant positions. To gain credibility, the youngest gave a tip to his captors. At the place where they had been found, but higher up, further into the mountains in a well-stocked cabin, they could find some eminent Nazis. They didn't know their identities but knew they were important people by how they dressed, the comforts they had despite the circumstances, and because someone had sent them to bring supplies. The British found the site without problems and arrested 7 people. 6 were dressed as officers. The remaining one presented himself as an important German businessman. He wore a warm jacket, leather pants, and expensive boots. Upon arrival at the detachment, the other 6 were placed in a cell while the businessman was allowed to move freely around the place. Until someone thought they recognized him, that was no businessman. That man was a murderer. The British officer, once this man passed by, setting him up for a trap to determine his identity, called out with a slightly German-accented commanding voice, "Globocnik." The short, overweight man turned his head, responding to the call. As soon as he realized his almost reflexive act, he tried to continue as if nothing had happened. The English commander ordered him to be placed in the most secure cell they had. They had caught the man responsible for the Nazi extermination camps. But as he was being taken to his confinement, Odilo Globocnik, in a quick movement, put something in his mouth and clenched his jaws tightly, helping himself with his hands. He fell almost immediately and convulsed on the ground. His skin turned purple. He had bitten down on a cyanide pill. Someone described him as the vilest person in the vilest organization that ever existed, a despicable being with an insatiable thirst for killing, an unquenchable, murderous appetite. Odilo Globocnik prided himself on being the Nazi who had eliminated the most Jews. He was the one who oversaw the construction and operation of the extermination camps of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Globocnik was a corrupt official who had been dismissed, but his audacity, lack of limits, and closeness to Himmler had restored his power, and he was willing to do whatever necessary to keep it. When he was given the order to create these camps, he spoke to his men. "The Reichsführer of the SS has just entrusted us with a new task. I am so grateful that you can be sure his wishes will be fulfilled immediately." He was the one who coordinated and supervised the construction of the extermination camps. Belzec did not have cremation ovens, but it did have gas chambers. The method Globocnik chose was carbon dioxide. His men killed thousands of Polish and Russian Jews per hour. After a few months in operation, he ordered the construction of new gas chambers that could hold 2,000 people each. It is estimated that in Belzec alone, 600,000 Jews were murdered. Odilo Globocnik was buried, without ceremony, in a field beyond the church walls. The fall of the butcher, the brutal end of Dirlewanger. Born in 1895 in Würzburg, Dirlewanger's path to infamy began long before the rise of the Third Reich. A veteran of World War I, he emerged from that conflict as a decorated lieutenant, his chest adorned with both classes of the Iron Cross. But beneath the appearance of military honor lay a deeply disturbed individual, described by his contemporaries as a violent, alcoholic fanatic, mentally unstable. In the tumultuous years following Germany's defeat, Dirlewanger found purpose in the ranks of the Freikorps, right-wing paramilitary groups that foreshadowed the brutality to come. His descent into depravity accelerated in 1934, when he was convicted of raping a 13-year-old girl from the League of German Girls. This heinous act cost him his doctorate, his Nazi Party membership, and his freedom for 2 years. However, the Nazi regime's insatiable appetite for violence offered Dirlewanger a chance at redemption. In 1940, he was admitted to the SS and given command of a special unit that would become infamous as the Dirlewanger Brigade. Initially composed of convicted poachers, this unit evolved into a collection of hardened and sadistic criminals, unleashed in Eastern Europe with devastating effects. The atrocities committed by Dirlewanger and his men in Poland and Belarus defy comprehension. In Belarus, they employed a particularly gruesome tactic, herding civilians into barns before setting them alight. During the Warsaw Uprising, the brigade's actions reached new heights of barbarity. Hospitals were set ablaze with patients still inside, while nurses and doctors endured unspeakable torments before being executed. As the Third Reich crumbled, Dirlewanger, like many of his fellow SS officers, tried to disappear into the chaos of defeat. On June 1, 1945, his luck ran out. Despite disguising himself in civilian clothes and assuming a false identity, he was recognized by a former concentration camp prisoner and immediately arrested. The testimony of Luftwaffe Lieutenant Anton Fussing, who shared a cell with Dirlewanger, offers a shocking insight into the SS officer's final ordeal. Fussing recounted seeing bleeding open wounds on Dirlewanger's face and his entire body covered in bleeding welts. Every night, Dirlewanger was dragged from his cell to face the wrath of his captors, his agonized screams echoing through the prison corridors. On June 7, 1945, just 6 days after his capture, Oskar Dirlewanger's reign of terror came to an ignominious end. The official cause of death was recorded as a heart attack, but the truth was far more brutal. Beaten relentlessly by Polish guards seeking vengeance for their fallen comrades, Dirlewanger's battered body finally succumbed to the abuse. In death, as in life, Dirlewanger remained a figure of controversy and dark speculation. For years, rumors persisted that he had somehow survived and found refuge in Egypt, serving in that country's army. These whispers of escape were only silenced in 1960, when his remains were exhumed and positively identified, confirming once and for all that the feared SS officer had met his end in that Polish prison. Richard Glücks, the sinister architect of the concentration camps. Among these architects of horror, few cast a longer shadow than Richard Glücks. the man who oversaw the vast network of concentration camps that became synonymous with the Holocaust. Born in 1889 in Odenkirchen, Germany, Glück's journey to the heart of Nazi evil began with his joining the party in 1930 and the SS 2 years later. By 1936, he had risen to a position of immense power and responsibility, becoming the chief of staff to Theodor Eicke, the inspector of concentration camps. On November 18, 1939, as World War II erupted in Europe, Glücks assumed the position of his mentor, succeeding Eicke as inspector of concentration camps. This promotion thrust him into a position where his decisions would directly impact the lives and deaths of millions. Under his watchful eye, the concentration camp system rapidly expanded. Glück's rise through the ranks of the SS was meteoric. By 1941, he had reached the rank of SS Brigade Führer, and 2 years later, he was promoted to SS-Gruppenführer and General Lieutenant of the Waffen-SS. As the war progressed, Glücks became increasingly involved in the implementation of the final solution, working closely with Oswald Pohl to orchestrate the mass murder of European Jews. His participation in a planning meeting with Heinrich Himmler in July 1942 on the subject of medical experiments on camp prisoners reveals the depth of his involvement in the regime's most atrocious crimes. He regularly received updates from Camp Commandant Rudolf Höss, ensuring he was fully aware of the mass killings and other horrific practices carried out under his authority. It was Glücks who proposed Auschwitz as a suitable site for a new concentration camp to Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich on February 21, 1940, setting in motion the creation of what would become the most infamous extermination camp in history. In a memorandum dated December 28, 1942, he ordered camp doctors to do everything possible with all available means to considerably reduce the mortality rate in the various camps. This directive, far from being a humanitarian gesture, was aimed at ensuring a steady supply of slave labor for the Nazi war machine. As the Third Reich crumbled in the face of Allied advances, Glücks, like many of his fellow SS officers, attempted to evade justice. The destruction of the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt buildings in Oranienburg on April 16, 1945, marked the beginning of the end. Glücks and his wife first fled to Born and then to Flensburg, desperately seeking to escape the reckoning that awaited them. On May 10, 1945, just 2 days after Germany's unconditional surrender, Richard Glück's reign of terror came to an abrupt end. At the Mürwik naval base in Flensburg-Mürwik, he reportedly swallowed a cyanide capsule, choosing suicide over facing justice for his crimes. His death, like that of many high-ranking Nazis, was a final act of cowardice, denying his countless victims the chance to see him answer for his actions. Otto Ohlendorf, the long wait for justice. While some SS generals met swift fates in the chaotic aftermath of World War II, others faced a prolonged reckoning with justice. Among these was Otto Ohlendorf, a man whose actions during the war would haunt him for years after Germany's defeat. As commander of Einsatzgruppe D, Ohlendorf oversaw a campaign of mass murder that left tens of thousands dead in southern Ukraine and Crimea. His fate would become a testament to the slow and meticulous wheels of post-war justice. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 thrust Ohlendorf into a role that would define his legacy of brutality. Appointed commander of Einsatzgruppe D, he led one of the 4 mobile death squads tasked with exterminating Jews, Romani people, and Soviet political commissars in the wake of the advancing German army. Under Ohlendorf's command, Einsatzgruppe D operated in southern Ukraine and Crimea, leaving a trail of mass graves and shattered communities in its wake. The methods employed by Ohlendorf and his men were as efficient as they were horrific. Victims were gathered under the pretense of resettlement, stripped of their belongings and transported to execution sites. There they faced death at the hands of multiple shooters, a technique Ohlendorf implemented to diffuse personal responsibility among his executioners. When Himmler later ordered the use of gas vans to kill women and children, Ohlendorf complied, although some of his men preferred shootings, finding the task of unloading bodies from the vans psychologically distressing. Ohlendorf's justifications for his actions revealed the depth of the moral perversion of Nazi ideology. He argued that killing the children was necessary. as they would grow up to become adults who might pose a threat to the Reich. This chilling logic underpinned the systematic murder of entire communities, with Einsatzgruppe D reporting the killing of 90,000 people, mainly Jews, between June 1941 and June 1942. As the tide of the war turned against Germany, Ohlendorf returned to the Reich Ministry of Economic Affairs, perhaps hoping to distance himself from the horrors he had overseen. But the collapse of the Nazi regime in May 1945 quickly ended any illusions of escaping justice. Arrested alongside Heinrich Himmler, Ohlendorf found himself facing intense interrogations, during which he revealed the criminal nature of the German campaign in the East. The Einsatzgruppen trial, which began on September 29, 1947, brought Ohlendorf to face the consequences of his actions. As the main defendant, he showed no remorse, justifying the killings as necessary to secure Lebensraum for the German Reich. His admission of having moral scruples while carrying out orders, along with his insistence that it was unthinkable for a subordinate leader to disobey state orders, painted the picture of a man trapped between conscience and ideology, ultimately choosing the latter. On April 10, 1948, the verdict was delivered. Ohlendorf was found guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and membership in criminal organizations. The sentence was death, but the execution of this judgment did not come quickly. For 3 years, Ohlendorf languished in custody, his life hanging by a thread as appeals and legal maneuvers played out. The long wait for justice finally ended on June 7, 1951. At the age of 44, Otto Ohlendorf was executed by hanging. Even in his final moments, he maintained that he had acted correctly and had done nothing wrong, a chilling testament to the enduring power of Nazi indoctrination. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer tried at Nuremberg. In 1942, after the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, he was appointed head of the SD, taking control of the Gestapo and the concentration camp system. In January 1943, Himmler entrusted him with the leadership of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, making him the right hand of the SS chief. He was promoted to Obergruppenführer and General of the Police, positions he held until the end of the war. Although he was not as cunning and intelligent as Heydrich, he stood out for being an indefatigable worker, a tenacious and incisive manager. In the autumn of that year, he organized Operation Long Jump, aimed at assassinating the Allied leaders during the Tehran Conference. However, the operation failed when the plan was discovered by Soviet intelligence. As the main person responsible for Reich security, he personally directed the investigations and persecutions following the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in 1944. He organized groups of officers from his department, supervised thousands of interrogations and reports, and administered Hitler's political revenge. He also oversaw the People's Courts led by Roland Freisler. These actions earned him personal recognition and appreciation from Hitler, giving him direct access to the Führer, bypassing Martin Bormann. Rumors even began to spread that Himmler himself feared him, as his intimidating figure with facial scars and a volatile temper made him one of the most feared characters of the regime. In December 1944, he received the Knight's Cross of the War Merit Cross with swords for his services to the Reich and was promoted to General of the Waffen-SS. On April 18, 1945, Himmler appointed him Commander-in-Chief of German forces in Southern Europe, a symbolic position due to the military debacle. By the end of April, realizing that Germany had lost the war, he fled the Reich capital with 2 aides. He headed towards the Austrian Tyrol and settled in Altaussee, a place he knew from vacationing there. He tried to negotiate an Austrian surrender with the Allies, unsuccessfully. Posing as a doctor with false documentation, he was detained by a US patrol on May 12th. He was recognized when his lover, waiting for him, called out his name. He was handed over to the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, accused of crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. A Spanish prisoner from the Mauthausen camp testified against him, providing photographs of a visit to the camp with Himmler and other officers. Auschwitz camp commandant Rudolf Höss also testified. During the early sessions of the trial, he suffered episodes of subarachnoid hemorrhage and was admitted to a hospital. His lawyer, Kurt Kaufmann, requested his acquittal on health grounds, but forensic doctors reported that his condition was beginning to improve, and the tribunal rejected the request. In his defense, he claimed that his role as head of the RSHA was merely nominal, and that he was only involved in espionage and intelligence matters, denying knowledge of Hitler's plans regarding the war and the final solution. He argued that Himmler was the true mastermind behind the atrocities committed. On September 30th, 1946, the tribunal found him not guilty of crimes against peace, but guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. On October 1st, he was sentenced to death by hanging, and the sentence was carried out at 1:36 a.m. His last words were, "I have loved my German people and my fatherland with a warm heart. I have fulfilled my duty under the laws of my people, and I feel that this time my people were led by men who were not soldiers, and crimes were committed of which I had no knowledge. Germany, good luck." In 2001, his personal seal was found in an alpine lake in Styria, Austria, 56 years after he threw it away to hide his identity. It was recovered by a Dutch tourist on vacation there. The seal had the engraved words, Chef der Sicherheitspolizei und des SD, Chief of the Security Police and the SD. Paul Blobel, the man behind the bone mills. In the blood-soaked annals of the Third Reich, few figures embodied the cold efficiency of Nazi extermination policies like Paul Blobel. As commander of Sonderkommando 4A, a subunit of Einsatzgruppe C, Blobel oversaw some of the most notorious massacres on the Eastern Front. The death fields of Babi Yar stood as a grim testament to his ruthless efficiency, with over 33,000 Jews murdered in just 2 days under his direction. But it was Blobel's role in Action 1005 that truly distinguished him in the pantheon of Nazi war criminals. As the Reich began to crumble under the weight of Allied advances, Heinrich Himmler tasked Blobel with an impossible mission: erase all traces of the mass murders carried out by the Einsatzgruppen. This secret operation, which began in 1942, saw Blobel oversee the exhumation and cremation of hundreds of thousands of bodies from mass graves across Eastern Europe. The methods employed in Action 1005 were as macabre as they were methodical. Under Blobel's direction, special units known as Blobel Commandos used giant grills made of railway tracks to burn bodies exhumed from mass graves. The ashes were then ground into bone meal to further conceal the evidence of Nazi atrocities. This gruesome process, carried out in utmost secrecy, was a desperate attempt to hide the magnitude of the Holocaust from the advancing Allies and future generations. As the Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, Blobel, like many of his SS comrades, tried to evade justice by blending into the chaos of post-war Germany. However, his freedom was short-lived. Allied forces, armed with evidence of his crimes, soon caught up with the man behind the bone mills. Blobel's capture marked the beginning of a legal process that would expose the full horror of his actions to the world. On the stand at Nuremberg, Blobel stood alongside other high-ranking SS officers during the Einsatzgruppen trial. The evidence presented against him was overwhelming, painting a picture of a man who had orchestrated mass murders with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. Witnesses recounted the horrific scenes at Babi Yar and other killing sites, while documents detailed the extent of the grim work of Action 1005. Faced with a mountain of evidence against him, Blobel's attempts at deflection crumbled. In a clear admission that revealed the magnitude of his crimes, he stated, "I must assume full responsibility for what happened within the borders of Ostland, within the SS, South Dakota, and Gestapo. This greatly increases my guilt." This acknowledgement, however, did little to mitigate the severity of his actions in the eyes of the tribunal. On April 10, 1948, the verdict was delivered. Paul Blobel, the man who had sought to erase the evidence of Nazi atrocities, was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death by hanging, a fate that awaited him alongside other architects of the Holocaust. For 3 years, Blobel languished in prison as appeals and legal maneuvers played out. Finally, on June 7, 1951, he faced his final moments in Landsberg prison. As he stood before the gallows, Blobel remained unrepentant, his last words a chilling reflection of the ideology he had served to the end. "I die in the faith of my people. May the German people be aware of its enemies." With these words, Paul Blobel, the man behind the bone mills, met his end. Hans-Adolf Prützmann, suicide before capture. In the twilight of the war, Heinrich Himmler appointed Prützmann as the plenipotentiary for a grim operation known as Werwolf. This clandestine initiative aimed to create a resistance force that would continue fighting behind enemy lines, even as Germany faced imminent defeat. Prützmann threw himself into this role with the fervor of a true believer. He oversaw the training of small groups of fanatical Nazi supporters, preparing them for a campaign of terror and disruption against the advancing Allied forces. However, the grand vision of a widespread guerrilla campaign quickly crumbled in the face of reality. The rapid advance of Allied forces, coupled with the exhaustion and demoralization of the German population, meant that the Werwolf operation was doomed from the start. As Germany's defeat became inevitable, Prützmann found himself retreating westward alongside the remnants of the once mighty Wehrmacht. The man who had once wielded considerable power within the SS hierarchy now faced the prospect of capture and trial for his wartime actions. The fear of Allied retribution loomed large in the minds of many high-ranking Nazis, and Prützmann was no exception. The exact circumstances of Prützmann's capture remain uncertain. What is known is that on May 21, 1945, just weeks after Germany's unconditional surrender, Prützmann's flight came to an abrupt end. Cornered by Allied forces, the architect of the failed Werwolf operation faced a moment of reckoning. Rather than surrender and face trial for his crimes, Prützmann made a fatal decision. In a final act of defiance, Hans-Adolf Prützmann chose to take his own life. Prützmann's suicide had significant implications for post-war justice. His death meant that valuable information about the inner workings of the SS and the failed Werwolf operation would never come to light. Leonardo Conti, the end of the Nazi health minister. As the Reich health leader, Conti wielded enormous influence over the health policies of the Third Reich, using his position to implement some of the regime's most abhorrent practices. His involvement in the notorious Action T4 program placed him at the epicenter of the Nazi euthanasia campaign, a systematic effort to exterminate those deemed unworthy of life due to mental or physical disabilities. Under Conti's supervision, the euthanasia program transformed from a theoretical concept into a horrific reality. Hospitals and care centers, once places of healing and compassion, became sites of mass murder. Conti's meticulous planning and administration ensured the smooth operation of this death machinery, with thousands of vulnerable individuals falling victim to the Nazis' twisted concept of racial hygiene. The methods employed in the euthanasia program were as diverse as they were horrific. Starvation, lethal injection, and gas chambers found their place in the arsenal of murder, with Conti overseeing the development and implementation of these killing techniques. His cold, bureaucratic approach to mass murder exemplified the banality of evil that characterized much of the Nazi leadership. As Allied forces closed in on Berlin in the final days of the war, Conti, like many of his Nazi compatriots, faced the harsh reality of imminent defeat. The man who had once held the power of life and death over countless individuals now found himself at the mercy of those seeking justice for his crimes. Arrested by Allied authorities, Conti was thrust into a world far removed from the halls of power he had once walked with impunity. The walls of his prison cell must have seemed a far cry from the opulent offices where he had issued orders that condemned thousands to death. As he awaited trial, Conti surely contemplated the weight of his actions and the likelihood of facing severe punishment for his role in the Nazi regime's atrocities. The prospect of standing before an international tribunal, forced to account for his participation in one of history's darkest chapters, loomed over him. On October 6, 1945, in his cell in Nuremberg, the former Reich health leader hanged himself, using the same skills he had once employed to end the lives of others. August Zehnder, the forgotten fate of the Waffen-SS Brigade Führer. In the extensive hierarchy of the SS, Zehnder carved out a position of significant influence. As an SS Brigade Führer and Major General of the Waffen-SS, he was among the upper echelons of Hitler's most fanatical followers. His wartime service saw him take command of the SS division Viking, a unit composed of volunteers from various countries, drawn to the Nazi cause by promises of adventure and ideological fervor. Zehender's leadership during the war earned him accolades within the Nazi regime, including the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves. This prestigious decoration, awarded for extreme bravery on the battlefield or successful military leadership, marked Zehender as a man of particular value to the Third Reich. As the Reich crumbled in the spring of 1945, Zehender, like many of his SS comrades, found himself caught in the chaos of defeat. The once feared SS general now faced a difficult choice: surrender to the Allies and face possible trial for war crimes, or attempt to evade capture and blend into the ruins of post-war Europe. For a time, Zehender chose the latter, joining the ranks of former Nazi officials who desperately sought to escape justice. Ultimately, Zehender's bid for freedom proved futile. Allied authorities, armed with lists of wanted SS officers and aided by a network of informants, eventually caught up with the former SS general. The circumstances of his capture, like much of his post-war activities, remain murky, lost in the chaos of Europe's most devastating conflict. Following his arrest, Zehender found himself interned alongside countless other former Nazi officials and military officers. The Allied powers, grappling with the monumental task of bringing Nazi war criminals to justice, established a vast network of internment camps to house those suspected of complicity in the regime's crimes. It was in one of these camps that Zehender spent the immediate post-war years, his fate hanging in the balance as investigators sifted through the mountain of evidence against the former Nazi leaders. However, despite his high rank within the SS and his command of a Waffen-SS division, Zehender's final fate remains somewhat mysterious. Unlike figures such as Ernst Kaltenbrunner or Rudolf Höss, whose trials and executions became emblematic of the Nuremberg process, Zehender appears to have slipped through the cracks of post-war justice. Perhaps the most significant factor in Zehender's disappearance from historical records was the sheer scale of the task faced by Allied prosecutors. With thousands of former Nazi officials in custody and limited resources to bring them all to trial, priorities had to be set. High-profile figures and those directly implicated in the worst atrocities of the Holocaust naturally took precedence. Zehender, despite his high rank, may have been considered a lower priority compared to more urgent cases. Additionally, the specific nature of Zehender's activities during the war may have played a role in his lesser-known fate. While commanding a Waffen-SS division certainly implicated him in the broader crimes of the Nazi regime, direct evidence linking him to specific atrocities may have been harder to come by. The betrayal of Arthur Neber, the SS's stab in the back to Hitler. While some SS generals escaped justice through mysterious disappearances or suicides, others faced a more complex fate. Among them was Arthur Neber, a man whose journey from Nazi collaborator to resistance member ended in a gruesome execution that epitomized brutality even in his final days. As the head of the Kripo, the criminal police of Germany, Neber wielded considerable power within the Third Reich's control apparatus. In 1939, Neber proposed sending Berlin's Sinti and Romani people to the planned reservations for Jews in the East. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 saw Neber assume an even more sinister role. As commander of Einsatzgruppe B, he oversaw mass executions that claimed thousands of lives. Near Minsk, his unit carried out systematic killings, with Neber noting that 500 Jews were shot daily in Vilna. The scale of atrocities under his command was overwhelming, with Einsatzgruppe B reporting the murder of over 45,000 people by November 14, 1941. However, as the tide of the war turned against Germany, Neber's loyalties began to shift. In a twist that highlights the moral complexities of the Nazi era, he became involved in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler in 1944. This conspiracy, which brought together a diverse group of German military and civilian leaders, aimed to overthrow the Nazi regime and negotiate peace with the Allies. Neber's role in the plot was to lead a team tasked with killing Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful and feared figures in the Nazi hierarchy. The failure of the assassination attempt on Hitler set off a chain of events that would seal Neber's fate. As the regime's retribution swept across Germany, Neber was forced into hiding, desperately trying to evade capture by the very system he had once served. For months, Neber managed to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. However, in January 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of Allied advances, Neber's luck ran out. Betrayed by a friend, he fell into the hands of those seeking vengeance for the failed coup attempt. The People's Court, presided over by the infamous Roland Freisler, wasted no time in condemning Neber to death. On March 2, 1945, with Berlin under constant Allied bombardment and Soviet forces closing in, Neber was sentenced to die for his involvement in the plot against Hitler. Neber's manner of execution reflected the vengeance of a regime in its death throes. On March 21, 1945, in Berlin's Plötzensee prison, Arthur Neber met a gruesome end. Following Hitler's specific orders that the guilty should be hanged like cattle, Neber was executed by being hanged from a meat hook, a method designed to prolong suffering and humiliate the condemned. This brutal method of execution, usually reserved for common criminals, was a final act of vengeance against those who had defied Hitler's authority. The use of meat hooks to hang the conspirators was a deliberate degradation, stripping them of dignity even in death. Karl Hermann Frank, the final fate of his public execution in Prague. After the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, Frank unleashed a storm of vengeance on the Czech people. Under his command, SS forces and police transforming it into a hell of death and destruction. The brutality of the operation was staggering. All men over 15 were executed on the spot, women were sent to concentration camps, and most of the children were either killed or sent for Germanization. As Allied forces closed in on the collapsing Nazi, Frank found himself trapped in a web of his own making. His capture marked the beginning of a legal process that would expose the full extent of his actions to the world. The man who had once wielded immense power as the highest-ranking SS leader in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia was now powerless before a Czechoslovak court. Faced with the mountain of evidence against him, Frank's attempts to deflect responsibility, clear admission that revealed the magnitude of his crimes, he stated, "I must assume full responsibility for what happened within the borders of Ostland, within the SS, South Dakota, and Gestapo. This acknowledgement, however, did little to mitigate the severity of his actions in the eyes of the court. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one. Karl Hermann Frank was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death, a fate that awaited him in the very city he once ruled with an iron fist. 1946, Karl Hermann Frank met his end in a public execution in Prague. The decision to carry out the sentence in full view of the public was deliberate, intended to serve as a cathartic moment for a nation that had suffered greatly under Nazi occupation. Thousands gathered to witness the final moment, much suffering to their land. Fallen in the shadows, the dark legacy of the Waffen-SS generals. By 1945, even the old soldier Dietrich had grown tired of Hitler's leadership. He gave his all in the fight with dwindling resources and was forced to retreat near Vienna, resulting in his men being ordered to remove their Adolf Hitler cuff titles. According to some reports, all these were placed in a chamber pot, with the order that it be personally returned to the Führer. A day after the final ceasefire in the West, Dietrich and his family surrendered to the Americans in Austria. As an established commander of the Leibstandarte, Dietrich was charged with several crimes at the Nuremberg trials, including the Malmedy massacre. Initially sentenced to life imprisonment, this penalty was later reduced to 25 years following testimony from fellow officers. In the end, he was a free man after serving 10 years. This did not last long, as German authorities were quick to charge him, quite oddly, for his role during the Nazi internal struggles on the Night of the Long Knives. Having served most of a 19-month sentence, Dietrich was finally released on February 2, 1958. Dietrich remained close to his men after his release and played a significant role in forming the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS. Despite maintaining strong ties with his former comrades and fighting for their cause, Dietrich stayed away from any post-war political ambitions. Sepp Dietrich died of a heart attack in Ludwigsburg, Baden-Württemberg on April 21, 1966 at the age of 73, and his body still rests in the city's Neuer Friedhof cemetery. The respect among his subordinates and peers remained solid until the end, and more than 6,000 people attended his funeral. Another important general of the Waffen-SS was Herbert Otto Giel. When the end of the war was evident, he surrendered to the American troops to avoid surrendering to the Soviets. He was a prisoner of the Americans for 3 years until his release in May 1948. Herbert Otto Giel was highly regarded for his tactical skills and qualities. He commanded Waffen-SS units at the regiment, division and corps levels with distinction during the war. Giel was popular among his men for his personal bravery and was known for the walking stick he usually carried. After the war, he worked for a newspaper until 1958. He also had a small bookstore. Giel was the founder of a magazine for veterans of the Viking Division, the Vikingruf. On December 26, 1966, Herbert Otto Giel died of a heart attack in Stemmen, near Hanover. He was buried in the local cemetery of that town. Another important general of the Waffen-SS was Heinz Reinefahrt, who also had a controversial fate. Heinz Reinefahrt was requested by Poland for extradition at the end of the war. However, British and American authorities denied the request on the grounds that Reinefahrt could serve them as a witness in the Nuremberg trials. After the trials, he was arrested and tried for war crimes in a local court in Hamburg, but was released for lack of evidence. In December 1951, he was elected mayor of the town of Westerland in Schleswig on the island of Sylt. In 1962, he was elected a member of the Schleswig-Holstein Assembly. After his term ended in 1967, he continued his career as a lawyer. The Polish government continued to request his extradition for many years, but it was routinely denied by the West German government. Additionally, the government granted him a general's pension and recognition of his military rank. He died in 1979 in his mansion in Sylt. Heinrich Müller, the mysterious fate of the Gestapo chief. As the head of the Nazi state secret police, Müller wielded immense power and influence within the regime's control and repression apparatus. His rise through the ranks of the Nazi Party and the SS was rapid and ruthless, culminating in his appointment as head of the Gestapo in 1939. In this role, Müller became one of the main architects of the Holocaust, overseeing the implementation of Nazi policies and the persecution of Jews, political dissidents, and other perceived enemies of the state. Müller's efficiency and dedication to the Nazi cause earned him the nickname Gestapo Müller, to distinguish him from other officials with the same surname. His involvement in the planning and execution of the final solution was extensive, playing a crucial role in organizing the mass deportation and extermination of European Jews. Müller's cold and bureaucratic approach to his tasks belied the horrendous nature of his actions, as he methodically implemented policies that would result in the deaths of millions. As Allied forces closed in on Berlin in April 1945, Müller's movements became increasingly erratic and difficult to trace. The last confirmed sighting of the Gestapo chief was on May 1, 1945, in Hitler's Führer bunker, just one day after the dictator's suicide. From that moment, Müller's fate became one of the enduring mysteries of the post-war era, generating numerous theories and investigations that continue to this day. One prevalent theory suggests that Müller, like many high-ranking Nazi officials, took his own life in the final days of the war to avoid capture and prosecution. This scenario aligns with the actions of other prominent Nazis, such as Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels, who chose suicide over surrender. However, the absence of a body or any concrete evidence of Müller's death has led many to question this theory. Another possibility that has gained traction over the years is that Müller managed to escape Germany during the chaotic post-war period. Some reports suggest that he may have fled to South America, joining the ranks of other Nazi fugitives who found refuge in countries like Argentina and Brazil. This theory is supported by alleged sightings of Müller in various South American countries in the years following the war, although none of these claims have been definitively proven. Perhaps the most intriguing and controversial theory about Müller's disappearance is the suggestion that he may have been recruited by Western intelligence agencies or the Soviet Union. Given his extensive knowledge of Nazi operations and intelligence networks, Müller would have been a valuable asset to any government seeking to gain an edge in the emerging Cold War. Some historians have speculated that Müller may have struck a deal with the CIA or other Western agencies, trading his expertise for protection and a new identity. Conversely, there are those who believe that Müller may have fallen into Soviet hands. The rapid advance of the Red Army into Berlin in the final days of the war positioned them to capture many high-ranking Nazi officials. If Müller was captured by the Soviets, it is possible that he was interrogated and then either executed or held in secret for his intelligence value. Despite numerous investigations and the declassification of wartime documents, the true fate of Heinrich Müller remains unknown. In 2013, a German historian claimed to have found evidence that Müller died in Berlin in 1945 and was buried in a mass grave, but this claim has been disputed by other experts. The lack of conclusive evidence has allowed the mystery surrounding Müller's disappearance to persist, fueling ongoing debates and speculations. Rudolf Höss, the sinister fate of the Auschwitz commandant. While some Nazi leaders disappeared into the shadows of history, others faced a reckoning that would etch their names into the annals of infamy. Among them, one figure stood out as the embodiment of the horrors of the Holocaust, Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. His story would become a symbol of the brutal efficiency of the Nazi extermination machine and the cold, bureaucratic nature of the evil that defined the Third Reich. Höss's journey into darkness began in 1934, when he joined the SS, rising quickly through the ranks due to his unwavering dedication to the Nazi cause. On May 1, 1940, he received an appointment that would forever link his name with one of history's greatest atrocities, Commandant of Auschwitz. Under Höss's meticulous direction, Auschwitz transformed from a relatively small concentration camp into a vast death complex, encompassing three main camps: Auschwitz-Thalmaus I, the administrative center, Auschwitz II Birkenau, the extermination camp, and Auschwitz III Monowitz, a labor camp. The chilling efficiency with which Höss oversaw the murder of millions spoke to a level of detachment that would horrify even the most hardened investigators. He lived with his wife and children in a villa near the camp, creating a surreal juxtaposition between his role as a family man and his duties as an architect of genocide. Höss's implementation of Zyklon B gas chambers streamlined the killing process, enabling the death of thousands within hours. As the tide of the war turned against Nazi Germany, Höss fled Auschwitz, assuming a false identity and blending into the chaos of defeat. For nearly a year, he evaded capture, working as a laborer under a fake name. However, on March 11, 1946, British troops finally caught up with the elusive commandant near Flensburg, Germany. Höss's capture marked the beginning of a new chapter in the quest for justice for the millions who perished under his supervision. During his trial, Höss's testimony provided a chilling glimpse into the mind of a man who had overseen unimaginable horrors. "I commanded Auschwitz until December 1, 1943, and estimate that at least 2.5 million victims were executed and exterminated there by gassing and burning, and at least another 500,000 succumbed to starvation and disease, making a total of about 3 million dead," he declared. His words a clear admission of the scale of the atrocities committed under his command. The Polish Supreme National Tribunal wasted no time in reaching its verdict. Rudolf Höss was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, his actions deemed so heinous that only the maximum punishment would suffice. The sentence was death by hanging, a fate that awaited him in the very place where he had orchestrated mass murder on an industrial scale. On April 16, 1947, Rudolf Höss faced his final moments in a place all too familiar to him, Auschwitz. The decision to execute him at the former death camp carried powerful symbolism, a form of poetic justice for the countless victims who had perished there under his supervision. As he stood before the gallows, Höss remained stoic, his demeanor a chilling reminder of the cold efficiency with which he had carried out his duties.